Hello guys and welcome back to new lecture. Tonight I'm going to teach you how to play against very annoying system against Caro Kann Advanced. It's c5. It's called Botvinnik Carl system. And here when they play c5, they keep the light square bishop open and they like to still go with the light square bishop either on f5 or g4 if you, for example, play a move like c3 or something similar. Because of that, I'm of opinion that you absolutely have to be familiar with the following type of plans and systems by white. It's certainly one of the most annoying lines of all my students against Caro Kann because somehow we are more or less used on how to treat and how to play positions when they play bishop f5, because we're all like taught how to treat French systems when the light square bishop is shut off. Now we're all like familiar what to do when the light square bishop is out, but not many people know how to simply treat these positions when they play this early c5. That's why you have me. So let's go. After like c5, we have to take. Giri in his latest course gave an approach with c3, and that's interesting. But it's more or less classic and has some other transpositions in some other openings. My choice is to take on c5 and to go with this. When you take on c5, they in general have two options: to play e6 or to play knight c6. Statistically speaking, in the past, knight c6 has been absolutely the most popular reaction by black. But it's not a case anymore nowadays because of some computer move after knight c6 f4. Lots of people tend to play first e6. So let's go with first knight c6 and then we're gonna check e6 at a fourth move by black as the main move. When they play knight c6, there are so many options for a white. Just like I told you, lately, one of the most popular moves, and according to the engine +1 for white, is f4. I'll be honest with you. With all these students of myself around, I've been teaching most of my students to play this f4. Including myself, I just have to tell you that it's difficult for playing. And that we all had some problems with some random like moves by black, and somehow there are like certain amount of difficulties. Although I know that we cannot go with like typical things and like some general plans in that f4 line, I avoid to show you and to teach you that stuff. Another line could be a3, which also could be interesting with the idea of b4, but I absolutely think that the old move of Movsesian is absolutely the easiest approach by white. I also played a couple of tournament games, including World Junior Champion Grandmaster Miladinovic, where I won with white pieces very convincingly. So I absolutely believe it's the easiest way of playing with the white pieces. Bishop b5. I'm gonna put it this way. They play knight c6. They want to get the pawn back. You play bishop b5. You say, no way. I'm gonna pin your knight, I'm gonna defend my pawn, and I'm not gonna give up the pawn on c5 just like that. They gotta go with e6. And now when they go with e6, they just want to get a pawn back on c5. You say, no way, not this time. I'll play bishop e3. So, having these two bishops on a3 and b5, you're just keeping the pawn on c5 as long as possible. And now, they have two type of possibilities. They can go with bishop d7, where they immediately threaten to take on e5, and they can go with knight g on e7. In my opinion, both of these are relatively easy for playing with the white pieces. So let's go. If they go for knight g on e7, they're not threatening anything yet. Although, they're just solidifying these knights, and they can just say, okay, if you ever want to take on c6, I'll be recapturing by knight. But at the same time, knight on e7 can go on f5 and harass this bishop. And if they win the dark square bishop, they can easily win afterwards the pawn on c5 as well. That's why you have to be very precise here and play move c3. What's the point of c3? By playing c3, you solidify your pawn structure and you say, hey man, if you play knight f5, if you want to take on e3 and afterwards take on c5, I'm just going to play bishop d4, stick my bishop right into the center and get a good position and get a good game. That's a good plan, that's a good idea, and I like this plan a lot for white. They can't get the pawn just like that. This is the point of early 7th move c3. And when they play bishop d7, thinking like, okay, but now I'm just threatening knight e5, definitely, you gotta come up with your decision. I always suggest give up the light square bishop for one of these knights. Why? Because when you take on c6, now they just have to decide whether they need to take by knight or by bishop. In general, more of these players take by bishop because they think, okay, taking by bishop is going to give me some d4 threats, while at the same time, my knight should be going on f5. But I'll be talking about these positions from different order moves when they play first 6th move bishop d7. Let's see what happens if they take by knight and once again threaten to take the pawn on e5. We've got nothing better but to play f4. Here you don't have time, so you gotta play f4 and you gotta build up position like this. Keep in mind, at a cost of the bishop pair, because we had to play bishop takes c6, we somehow kept the pawn up. You cannot play knight f3 because simply they will play queen c7, go after the pawn, and when you say, okay, but what's the difference now? Now they can take that bishop, you gotta take by pawn because queen cannot take, c5 is hanging, and now they play b6. And after this they have queen b6. With the bishop pair, with the pressure on both b2 and d4, black certainly has a good compensation. That's why we have to go with f4. And when we go with f4, we just defend not only the pawn on e5, but also the pawn on c5 as well. And now they have two options. They can play g5, breaking the pawn chain, or they can go with a5. For example, when I played all these blitz games, only good players went for g5, breaking these pawn structure, like on purpose and just like that. Those who play a5, they want to avoid solidifying the pawn structure with b4. Although we play a4, and now I'm willing to jump with my knight on a3 and eventually on b5 and potentially on d6. So when they play d4, we just take and they go knight b4. This knight b4 to go with bishop c6 looks very attractive. But after knight c3, bishop c6, knight f3, I'm just showing you we're up to pawns, and in the game, Majem battles against Ortiz played like 30 years ago, white easily managed to win this game without any problems. I don't want to bother you with this. This is why I believe they just have to go with g5. At the same time, g5 can have like a very, significant psychological pressure on you if they go this way. Because g5 looks like they're just breaking the pawn structure, and looks like, if we take on g5, they're just going to take in the central pawn on e5. Also, they have a bishop pair. They keep the game open. And that shows, importance. Why do we need to play these positions very carefully with white? Of course, we got to take. And now they have two moves. They can play knight e5, what everybody does, and h6. h6 reminds me on Banco Gambit reversed, just on the king side. Here you should never take on h6, but you should defend that pawn and keep on developing yourself, guys. Keep in mind, we got to defend on e5, we got to defend on g5, but most of all, we got to keep on developing ourselves. So we play knight f3. Any h takes g5, bishop g5, bishop e7 should be absolutely fine for us. And the reason for that is very simple. Because now we just trade off the bishop pair. Yes, they can get the pawn back, but it's one of those positions where two knights easily outplay knight, which is looking good, and pretty bad bishop. Also, we have a bone in their throat, and we also have a possibility to play along the f file against the weak pawn on f7. There is a nice game of Zizulkin from Poland here. So after knight bd2, one guy played long castles. This guy played long castles, rook dg8, played knight b3, queen c4, capture, played knight c5, and after this played rook to d2. I don't want to show you like the rest of this game, but take a look at this one. Two beautifully placed knights. Rook that controls d file and the defense potentially with g2 pawn. Bishop that does absolutely nothing, potentially weak pawn, backward pawn on f7. And here we have a very classic example where two knights easily outplay, for example, a bad bishop and relatively okay knight on c6 for black. Another thing, apart from h6, is what happens when they take on e5. You just play knight f3. And for example, I played a very nice blitz game like a few years ago. The guy went with the queen c7. And after queen c7, there is a very, I'd say, surprising line for white and very nice way for white to get a nice advantage. It's knight takes c5, queen takes c5, and boom, queen d4. You're offering these queens to trade. You're removing the dark square bishop possibly to go on g7, where absolutely for the rest of the game you're going to be left with the pawn up and should be like a technical part of the game for white being up a pawn. That's why after knight f3 they usually go with knight f3. Bishop g7 also, it doesn't bring them anything. Jolotia played many years ago like knight takes e5, queen h5, short castles, knight d2, and rook f to e1. Most of us would probably put this rook on the f file. No, you just want to put it here, and when they play e5, you go knight f3, you want to go rook a d1, and here you just want to play either bishop f2, bishop g3, going after the e5 pawn, or knight h4, knight f5, because they have lots of weaknesses there. Keep in mind, they gave up a pawn in the third move by playing c5, and they couldn't get it back. That's the good thing about this variation. Now, I just have to show you what's happening when they play knight e5, knight f3, and they just take on f3. In my opinion, that's the main line, the biggest number of games you'll find after they take on f3. So after they play knight takes f3, queen takes f3, they go bishop g7. After bishop g7, one of my students once asked me, Maya, what if bishop e5? We can play castles, they can maybe do something with a light square bishop like this. It looks scary at first glance, but it's nothing. And Grandmaster Anthony Wierig from France gave up a pretty good approach against Bagheri from Iran. So he played knight a3, threatening this bishop with tempo. Bishop d4, threatening bishop and rook. Bishop e4 is only move to save the piece. Queen f4, solidifying the defense of this. And after rook g8, which is only move, rook f1, threatening mate on f7. Everything came down with a tempo, and Wierig almost got the winning position after 16 moves. So you just have to know these patterns of fighting very concrete against their pretty concrete moves, such as bishop e5. When they go bishop g7, you play castles, threatening mate on f7, playing knight e2, completing your development, bishop b5, and what we had in previous example, we have here as well. They go bishop b5, but you shouldn't, pay so much attention on this one anyways. And you just go with rook f to e1. Just like I previously said, your rook doesn't belong on the f2 or f file, where you can double them due to the bishop on b5 and on a6 f1 diagonal, but your rook actually belongs on e1, and it wants to fight against potentially strong center once they play e5. So when they play like bishop c6 threatening d4, you play queen g3 and they go e5. I'll show you a very lovely game, or Frissa Nyberg, a Dutchman, who played a great, and I'd say model game for the whole system. You see, they got a bishop here, They have a strong center, and they basically believe that they have a relatively good compensation for the given pawn. But what can I say? Pawn is pawn. So let's go. Knight f3, you just threaten to take on e5. Bishop f2, you just threaten to take on e5. Rook to e3, you just want to double the rooks. At the same time, with these arrows I'm showing you, you would like to place your queen on h4, double your heavy pieces on the h file with a rook h3 and mate them. So after a5, queen h4. Now, queen on h4 didn't only open bishop g3 possibility, but also rook h3. And after queen c8, rook e1. Take a look at this one. Their center is good as long as it's kept, like flexible like this. As soon as they have to play d4 or e4, they're just suffering. So if they play e4, now the light square bishop becomes terribly bad and closed. Well, at the same time, bishop on g7 gets a little bit more open, but it's not that strong thanks to these golden pawns and the very, strong pawns against the bishop on g7. At the same time, these pawns on e4 and d5 just become static, and they cannot do anything with them. So after knight d4, bishop d7, Naibera played bishop rook e2, rook a6, played bishop e3, repositioning his pieces, rook f2, and he sacrificed here and won a very lovely game like this. I really enjoyed this game a lot, with lots of intermediary moves by white, and Naibera beat Eric Lomron, GM from Germany. Just like you see, we've seen all the possibilities when they play bishop e3 and when they simply go knight g on e7, bishop d7. And now on your question, but Maya, what if they play bishop d7 immediately? And what if they just want to take? You instantly have to take on c6, and now we have completely different type of the game. Completely different type of the game, since the bishop stands on c6. And they just want to push the pawn to d4 and open up the bishop and win the rook possibly, or just exchange by bishop takes g2. That's why in this position we just have to go with knight f3. Knight f3 prevents d4, definitely defends and supports the pawn on e5, and it looks great. Now they probably have to go with the knight e7 because they all want to harass the dark square bishop with knight f5. Now I'm going to show you my game against Miladinovic. So after c3, by now I already explained you when they play knight f5 and when they want to take this bishop and afterwards the pawn, you just have to play it here. But the critical thing happens now. They all have to play knight e4. That's not the only move. For example, Miladinovic against me played g5. That's a very interesting thing here that he went for against in Serbian championship exactly 10 years ago. And I still remember that game. I had a very lovely game there, which I managed to win. Although, I don't want to now bother you with my games. By the way, on g5, with the idea of g4, he told me he used it against Ivanchuk, I believe, and they drew the game. I did not play objectively h3, and probably the best move. I played g4, and I managed to win the game like that. If you ask me, on g5 it's better to play h3, because then even when they want to go with h5 and g4, they won't be able to do it that fast, because now when we play h3, we slow down their action on the king side, coped with g4. After like bishop d4, they just have to go with some of these moves. When they play knight takes d4, that's the main line, but before that, what happens if they just go with the queen c7? Very tricky move, played by Zoltan Olmasi, strong GM from Hungary. Idea is to take on d4 and afterwards to take on c5. After castles, they go all with bishop d5, threatening the bishop, and at the same time opening bishop c5. You play rook e1, bishop c5, and here you just go a4, kicking that bishop away, taking on c5 and playing knight bd2. In my opinion, having the possibility to play knight actually took place this knight. Knight b3, knight bd4, exchanging one of the knights and going knight against the bishop, always, since the position has blocking character, should favor should favor a little bit white. So after like bishop d4, there is also a move a5. That a5 is aimed against b4. You go castles and they take. And when you take, looks like when they play a4, no one and nothing can stop rook a5 or queen a5 capturing this pawn on c5. This is a very important moment for this variation, because here we have one of these rare occasions where I'm going to insist on two knights against two bishops. So position is pretty blocked, and you won't hear in many of these lessons that I'm going to favor knights against bishops. But here, knights are better than bishops. They threaten to play rook a5, and the thing is knight bd2. Now you're wondering, what the hell is this knight bd2? So when they play like queen a5, on rook a5, just give up the pawn and put the queen here, so they cannot take it by bishop because this one is hanging. So when they take by rook, they have a little bit misplaced rook. Although Jula Sachs, Hungarian GM, played against Croatian GM Zelčić, played rook fc1 with the idea of breaking at some point with c4, but I'm telling you, as long as they have this terribly placed light square bishop and pretty inactive bishop on f8, we definitely have to favor pair of the knights. So after queen a5, I'll show you the game of Mosesian against Hess, played in Germany like 15 years ago or approximately. b4, that's the point of knight bd2. And after they take, you take. And now this guy played queen a3, and everything looks cool. We have a broken pawn structure. We have a pair of the knights. Well, they have the pair of the bishops. They have the queen that absolutely blocked this pawn on a2. And they have pressure on the pawn on c5. Take a look at Movsesian and how carefully and nicely and easily managed to convert this position. This is a beauty. He played queen g4. Queen g4 is aimed against bishop c5 because g7 is weak. Now they have to commit themselves with a weakness g6. Movsesian played h4. With the h4, he's just willing to go with some h5 at some point and to provoke h5 by black. This guy played rook a4. He plays knight f to d4. He keeps defending this pawn on c5 for the time being. The thing is, okay, I mean, keep defending. He can always get the pawn back, but that's not a point. The point is that these bishops cannot work and they're not active at all. So what's happening there? After like h5, queen f3, rook c4. Played queen f6 and played rook to b1. Now he's getting himself ready for some actions. And after like bishop e7, queen f3, king d7, knight c6, b takes c6, playing knight d4. Just like you see, all of a sudden, Movsesian decided to give up the bishop, the pair of the knights. Now his rook on the b file goes after the king. Queen is fighting against this one. Rook is absolutely terribly placed on h7. This one on c4 is not placed better either. He doesn't care about the c3 pawn. So after queen c5, rook b7, king e8, rook f to b1, bishop d8, knight e6, he just finished off this guy in a nice tactical style. You can definitely spend much more time analyzing this variation and all these games, you know, like at home, but I'm here just to give you like the main ideas, and hopefully you enjoyed this one. Time to go for another line. Time to go for another line. If you have any questions, actually, knight c6, bishop b5, e6, bishop e3, bishop d7, take, knight f3, knight e7, c3, knight f5, bishop d4. I apologize to you, actually forgot to show you so many other things. When they play like knight takes d4 and queen takes d4, now we gotta check all these possibilities. So we've checked what Miladinovic played against me. You can check that game. I won in a very nice style and I beat world junior champion 2600 GM. Then You can check queen c7, what Olmashi does. Idea is play bishop b5 and fight against the c5. We've checked like things with a5. Idea is to fight against d4, but we always play the same fashion. And finally, what if knight takes d4? If knight takes d4, you just recapture by queen. That's a little bit surprising. Don't ask me. Maya, don't we play bishop d4 so we can recapture by pawn? No, we do not. Why? Because if they play c takes d4, b6, and all of a sudden these bishops start to get some space, start to get some activity, and if the queen especially comes on b6, it's going to be dangerous. So queen takes d4. After queen d4, now there are like so many possibilities. I'd like to begin with the most tempting one. Queen a5, they want to get the pawn back. I faced it so many times in blitz, but it's lost. Believe it or not, okay, maybe not lost, but it's much better for white. You play b4 and say, buddy, where are you going? I'm not going to give you the pawn back. Don't even hope for that. So they go queen a6 and they say, okay, but I won't allow you to make castle. Okay, but I'll play a4. Okay, man, but you're not threatening b5 because I'm going to play like this. Okay, maybe at the moment not, but I will. So they play b6, like breaking the pawns, and they just want to do something. The thing is, I want to play knight bd2, knight b3, defending this rook and threatening b5 afterwards. So the thing is, they urgently have to break these pawns on the queen side. And when they do it, we have a refutation found many years ago here. Looks like, looks definitely difficult. Because if we take on b6, they will capture by pawn. We will have problems with pawn on b4, with open a file, with pawn on a4, so many things. We also cannot make castle, don't forget about that. Refutation goes queen f4. We want to play knight g5. It's aimed against b takes c5, because if b takes c5, you just play knight g5 going after the pawn on f7, and after queen b7, boom, b5. They can't bring the bishop back to d7 because we want to win the pawn on f7. We're disconnecting connection on the 7th rank between the queen and the weak square f7, and white is winning. What a lovely, lovely line. And if they play anything like rook b8 or whatever, you play c takes, a takes, knight d4. I always enjoy when I place my knight on d4 like this, especially if it goes with tempo. Bishop d7. Now play b5 so you can finally make castle, queen a5. And very important rule for these positions. I insist on this one. And it's not going to be the first time I'll insist on this one. Knight on b1 stays there in order to defend the pawn on c3. So after rook c8, rook c1, bishop e7, queen goes on e3. We'd like to go knight d2. We'd like to go, okay, now we want to go because we defended the pawn on c3. We'd like to go knight 4 to b3, and we'd like to go with c4. What are we doing? We're actually unleashing that pawn and possibility in the queen side coat with c4 because we don't want to have problems with the pawn on c3 any longer. That's the thing. After like queen d4, queen a5 is one possibility. What happens if they play that normal classic a5 possibility? You just go with b4. Very lovely game between Zoltan Olmashi and De La Villa Garcia in Spain 20 years ago. So after like bishop e7, castles, castles, knight bd2, everything is normal. We're up a pawn, we defended everything. I don't see a compensation for them. The guy plays bishop, for example, b5, rook fc1, a takes, c takes, rook a4, a3, and when they play queen a8, looks like they block these pawns, bishop on b5 looks fairly good. These heavy pieces on the a5 looks good as well. You play queen e3. Why? Queen is defending the pawn on a3. You're opening up the possibility to simply block with the best blocking piece knight, past pawn on d4 by jumping with the knight on d4, and we're just doing great. It's a very, very nice one. This is the thing, and I just want to show you one thing. After a5, b4, they don't have to play like this. For example, I'll show you that famous game, a takes, c takes, and b6. To me, this looks like the most logical thing by black in order to break these pawns. It's more like a bluff. Take this pawn. You're up to pawns. They play rook a4. Take this pawn. I mean, defend it. And when they go with, for example, they cannot play bishop b4 because queen on d4 is defending the rook. So they have to go with bishop b5. It looks like we can't castle. Okay. At the moment they're down 2 pawns, but somehow these pawns will fall. No way. We play knight f2 d2. Simply, you can't play knight c3 because you're disconnecting connection between the queen and the rook, and they can play bishop b4. But you actually go with knight f2 d2. So what's so good about this? Now you can play knight c3. So when they play bishop b4, you can take either rook or bishop. Understand? So the king is not pinned anymore. So after queen a8, you play knight c3. They just say, okay, but I'm getting the pawn back. This is game Olmash against De La Villa. White moves and wins. Boom. b7, intermediary move. If you take by queen, I can take the rook. And De La Villa Garcia resigned. What a lovely game played in Pamplona many years ago. And if a3, and they go queen a8, like, I want to get the pawn back instantly. Actually, he threatens bishop b4 because this one is now hanging. You just go with castle, and you just say, okay, man, I'm up 2 pawns. We call this conversion. Conversion of the material advantage. You take the pawn, and now you absolutely play a lovely a takes b4. They take, and you play queen c5. This is the point. You won't find this type of analysis in so many, books, articles, or whatever. Queen goes on c5. You go after the bishop. You would like to play knight d4. You would like to play knight c3. You would like to avoid and not to allow them castling. And now you have like bunch of analysis. I don't want to bother you with all this stuff. I'm just going to put it this way. White is winning. And this is the game Arashchenko, Henkin. So let me just show you 226.50 guys, bishop b7, Arashchenko played rook c1, queen d8, knight f2 d2, solidifying these knights playing queen c7, captured, and he's been winning in that one. So just like you see in all these positions, you're just winning, and they just have to go for something else. By now we just realized that queen a5 doesn't seem to be working due to b4 and a4, and that crucial move queen f4, that a5 doesn't seem to be working because of early b4. And what happens if they just go with a classic bishop b7, like, let me just complete my development, put a castle and break it with f6. Here you gotta know the plan, and I'll insist on this one. You play castles, they go castles, you go knight b d2, and they go queen c7. You play rook fc1, and they go rook f8, and you play queen e3. It's always of a great importance to bring the queen back to e3, to over-support both e5 and c5, to simply open up possibility knight e4 for knight to jump, and to support the c5 pawn before that with b4. Apart from that, at some point you can also either play knight 2 to f3 or play f4, supporting the pawn on e5 and defending it like this. That's the way it is. And finally, if instead of bishop e7, they just go with queen c7, this is the last line that I need to show you in the systems. They just want to go with very simple. Your body play short castle, which would be mistake. They go bishop b5, and they get the pawn back, and now we're in problems. In order not to allow something like that, we go with b4 ourselves. We go with b4, we defend the pawn on c5. And after you go with b4, now any bishop b5, I can harass that bishop with a4. Any b6, I'm not in danger because I'm going to take and play castle. And take a look at this one. Once again, I need to insist on this position because I won all my games because I was familiar with the plan. So I'm not familiar with the analysis, concrete order moves or whatever. I'm familiar with the plan. So I know in this position what should be my setup. Usually I pause the video and tell you, hey guys, find the tactics and win the game. Here you can pause the video and try to find a plan for white. Okay, hopefully you paused the video and hopefully you found the plan. Plan goes with a3. It's such a difficult move, but let me just explain everything. This pawn structure supported by the knight on b1 is absolutely untouchable and unbreakable. Queen should be going back to e3, knight should be going to d4, rook should be going to a2, and then your rook usually goes on e1 to support and control e file and the e5 square. Well, you can play f4 or you don't have to play f4, but keep the knight on b1 as long as possible, so you shouldn't have any problems with the a3 and c3 pawns. After castles, queen e3, bishop b5, rook e1, rook fc8, knight e4, and I found game Kurnosov Maslak and Smits against Heberla. I won't show you both of these games, but I'm just going to show like 5 or 6 moves more. Take a look how Kurnosov played. He played f4. In my opinion, absolutely fine move. King h8, rook a2, f6. Keep in mind, we keep the knight on b1 as long as possible. He captured bishop f6. In my opinion, g takes f6 could look more logical, but e6 is hanging. So after bishop f6, rook f2, b5, knight b3. You now have control of this. I mean, terribly placed, especially the light square bishop. This one doesn't look better either. Okay, this one is only defender, but it has a great practical value in this position. After e5, f takes, rook e8. He played queen c5. After bishop e5, traded the queens off, went into simplifications like this, and went on to win this type of an endgame very easily. I like this game by Kurnosov. Another game is rook a2. According to engines, rook a2 look better. But if you ask me, I absolutely wouldn't listen any engines in these positions. All you need to know is to know following things. A knight on b1 keeps defending pawns on a3 and c3. This rook on a2 should go along the second rank, sometimes on c2, d2, f2, depending on circumstances and whatever position requires. Secondly, yes, you can always keep an option of playing f4 in these positions. And yes, any f6, they just have problems with either backward pawn on e6, or we have an amazing outpost on e5. So let me just show you the game Smits against Heberla. This guy played f6. I believe that they should keep waiting with f6, otherwise this lead to easy strategic game for white. So after a takes, bishop takes, knight e6, queen c4, rook tripling these pieces, playing queen d2, and when they exchanged everything, I just insist, take a look at this monstrously strong defensive placed knight on b1. He defends these pawns, and all the time they're just doing anything or everything to open up this. So after d4, queen e1, by the way, watch out, he's threatening rook, queen e1, threatening mate in 1. They gotta go rook f8, you play rook e4, take, rook e2, and after everything, Smits was winning. I gotta tell you one thing, keep in mind, for 30 moves, he hasn't moved his knight on b1, and that's a key strategic piece in white's game. I believe that I explained you everything more than good of what to do and how should you play these positions. So don't you dare to ask me, and don't you even dare to lose some games in these positions. Let's go with e takes e5 and nowadays more popular e6. e6, they've just locked the light square bishop and play some sort of a French, broken pawn structure for French, but there is a problem. They just need some time to get a pawn back on c5. Now I'm going to surprise you. I'm using Shirov's or Carlsen's move lately here to fight against this line, and to be honest with you, ever since I saw that game of Alexei Shirov, I fell in love with this line. They just want to get a pawn back. So my suggestion will be queen g4. Queen g4 is fighting against bishop takes c5. By the way, if you take on c5, we just take on g7 and we win the rook. So they can't do it. Now they either have to go and fight against the queen on g4 because it stands very annoyingly being placed there, or they gotta put all their efforts in getting one of these pawns back on c5 or a5. Although, even though they want to do something like that, they gotta pay the price. So let me just show you. After queen g4, they can go with knight c6. For example, it's very interesting. This is the most common continuation by black against me. When I play against top guys, I mean against GMs in blitz, they usually go with h5. So after knight c6, knight f3, you just develop knight, you defend the key pawn in your strategy. They still cannot take it because queen g7. So many times my opponents went for queen a5, somehow in blitz, thinking like, I can get the pawn back. No, buddy, you cannot. I'll play c3, and if you play bishop c5, I can choose to take on g7 and to lose the rook, or to play b4. I'm just telling you, they can never even think of this. That's what I'm telling you. So when they take by queen, like, I'm happy that I managed to get a pawn back, then I'm having a question for you. Why did you play this line if you're, like going and seeking like crazy to get a pawn back? No, we just play bishop to d3. And now we go into some type of Nimzovich type of games that he used to play against the French advanced. And he was the first one who came up with this blocking ideas of the queen g4. You have like a whole bunch of his games in his book, My System in Practice, where he played against e4, e6. I'm just going to show you. e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, c5, and Nimzovich went with this queen g4 move. In all these positions, he managed to win when they played c takes d4, knight f3, knight c6, and so on and so on. Can you imagine how big advantage you have if you manage to capture on c5, and when they play e6, you now play queen g4. And now you actually play an improved version, because not that you sack pawn on d4, but you actually won the pawn on c5. So after queen g4, they go knight c6, knight f3, and let's say they go knight e7. That's the most common thing against me. It's a very nice thing to do here, and to go and to develop your knight on c3. Of course, you can play bishop d3 and you're a tiny bit better. But knight c3 is the most precise move. Knight g6 looks like I'm going to get one of these pawns back. c5 or e5. But now you go with a very aggressive h4. You all know that by now I taught you in these lectures that you gotta go and fight against the rim knight. I mean, edge knight on g6 with the h for h5. So after knight e5, knight e5, knight e5, queen g3 threatening this knight, knight c6, and you play knight b5. What a lovely moment to claim advantage like this. Now they can't stop both knight c6 and knight c7 and knight a6. They gotta go e5, knight d6. You capture on g7, an important intermediary move. And when you take on d6, I mean, do I really have to explain you how better you are in an open game with a weak exposed king on d6 and the bishop pair for us? Finally, if they play queen c7, they just want to get a pawn back. This is exactly the moment where I need to tell you, you shouldn't give them possibility to get a pawn on e5 just like that. And even though knight c3 could be interesting after knight e5 and knight b5, I don't want to bother you with those lines. I'm just going to show you bishop b5. So I want to play bishop b5, and I want to defend my pawn on e5. You go knight g7. I just go castles. You play bishop d7, threatening this one. I'm going to play queen h5. I've just defended the pawn. So you cannot even play knight e5 to win the bishop. If bishop d7, knight d7. But I have knight e5, and when you play like this, I have queen f7. So just like you see, with the queen h5, I keep the pawn on e5 as it is, and white is much better. After bishop b5, bishop d7, you know how many times I explained you that you should give up this bishop for the knight. Bishop e3 to defend it. And once again, they can't take it because of lovely queen on g4. And here, we're analyzing game from the World Championship match between Tal and Botvinnik. Botvinnik played knight h6, and now Tal, yes, he probably said, okay, I, lost tempo with bishop e3, but now I'll take on h6. develop my knight b2, knight c5. The guy played queen c5 and played c4. This is a very lovely game by Michal Tal, because now, after long castles, short castles, rook d1, queen h4, he wanted to play a3, b4, and c5 and win the game afterwards. This was the World Championship game, and from the World Championship match, just like you see, Tal was much better in this position against Botvinnik. Once again, pair of the knights outplayed the pair of the bishops. And instead of knight c6, let's go with the knight d7 move. I remember playing one blitz game against Grandmaster Miroslav Markovic from my country. Idea is to capture this pawn on c5. Okay, if you can't capture it by bishop because g7 is hanging, I'm gonna take it by knight. So you play knight f3. And I'll show you here. I like this line a lot. Carlsen Naroditsky played 2 years ago. Naroditsky played knight c5. In my opinion, you're not supposed to capture on c5 by knight. Carlsen played bishop e2. Naroditsky played knight e7, castles, and played knight f5. Take a look at the game. Carlsen opens up the center, brings the rook on d1 with tempo, takes on c4, and plays knight c3. Just like you see, position is relatively cool. That queen on g4 now with the knight on f5 doesn't seem to be that special, but you can use it in the attack if they want to play bishop e7 into castles. So here Carlsen played very next move knight e4, removing probably the most valuable piece in White's game, and just removing the defender. So after h5, Magnus went with the queen e2. This guy captured rook takes d4 and played bishop c6. Magnus played bishop e3. Naroditsky played rook a5, fighting against b4. Magnus played the most logical move like this. And here Naroditsky was probably already hopeless. He played castles. Magnus captured on h5, played rook g4, played bishop h6, sacked that knight on d5 to open up the bishop on c4, threatened on g6, played queen h3 threatening bishop f8, played bishop f8, and made it Naroditsky like this. Beautiful game by Magnus Carlsen. That was on Chess24 back to 2021. A lovely game during COVID. So after knight d7, knight f3, queen c7. This is Shirov's game, and this is how I actually found out about the whole line. And this is why I'm sharing my analysis and my thoughts and my experiences with you. And hopefully you're gonna like it so much. So after queen c7, boom, bishop b5. You can't touch my pawn on e5. It's untouchable, baby. And if you go a6, I won't give you an easy time to get a pawn back. You can't take it by bishop, you can't take it by knight, you gotta take by queen. But taking by queen is not going to solve your problems. So after queen c5, watch out not to blunder queen before check. Queen before check would just get almost to equal position for black. So watch out not to allow them that. And because of that, you just go with c3. You bring the light square bishop back to c2. You avoid queen b4 and the queen trades, and white is easily better. After bishop b5, queen c5, Shirov played knight c3, Berkesh played knight e7, and Shirov brought a bishop back to d3. After like a6, played h4. I like this provocative move h4, which is aimed against knight g6 by black. He's sending a clear message. Don't you dare and mess with me to bring the knight on g6, because I'm gonna kick it away afterwards with g6. With h5. If knight g6, you first have to defend the pawn, go with h5. You first have to play now h5, and when they take the pawn, you play king f1. What a lovely way to take advantage of the queen being passed here, and this one, and threatening bishop f4 followed by rook e1. After f6, bishop f4, white is so much better, and white has full initiative. King on f1 is safe, and this reminds me of some whenever French positions with the king on f1. This modern h4 approach. When Berkesh played knight e6, Shirov played queen g3, queen a5, castles, and played h5. Looks cool, looks defendable. Shirov played bishop d2, queen c7, and played bishop f4. I don't know how can you play against Shirov and to allow him such a lovely type of the game where he's just going to attack you and sacrifice everything. At least try to defend yourself somehow. This guy played knight c5, and now he's like calling Shirov to make a masterpiece. Knight d5, he takes d5, and e6. He sacked a piece, he opened up the bishop to threaten the queen, and on top of all that, he just wants to take on f7. After like queen e7, he takes, king takes, rook e1, queen f6, knight g5, king g8, rook e8. Completely winning position, and black was lost. Beautifully played. In the game was knight d3. Shirov sacked another piece. Knight f4, threatened check, bishop f8, and after this, in typical Shirov style, if you take the queen, he's just going to move the rook here and to mate the king. Beautifully played. And you know, like, you cannot even my, you know, like satisfaction when I saw this game. And I said, oof, I gotta play like this. I really enjoy this system. And ever since then, I really won most of my games against e6 lines. Okay, I lose some blitz games here and there, but this is fantastic. So after like e6, queen g4, it's time for the final and probably the best move for black. It's h5. Although h5 has its pros and cons. First of all, yes, you're getting rid of the queen on g4, but at the same time, you're getting rid and releasing the pressure from the g7. But at the same time, you're weakening so much and you can't play castle afterwards. So queen goes on f4. There is also a possibility to go with the queen back on g3, but I like queen f4. Now they finally can say, oof, I can breathe away and I can get a pawn back. Okay, I don't have the queen anymore, but now I have that problem on h5. So we play knight f3. And here I played few like weeks ago against Luke McShane on Lead Chess and won in like 12 moves, I believe. I trapped his bishop on c5. The guy played queen b6. And on queen b6, I just used my idea of sacking the pawn. It's quite interesting that most of my friends ask me, what if they take on f2? Well, he didn't take on f2. He played something like knight e7. I believe that I played something like a3, threatening some b4. And somehow, I just remembered that I won that game and trapped his bishop on c5. But it wasn't with this primitive b4 trick for sure. The thing is, after bishop f2, you just go with the king on e2. And you don't have to worry about these positions. They get a pawn back. They get a pawn back. They win the pawn. But our king on e2 is in safety. We have great advantage in development. And after bishop c5, knight goes on c3 to win one of these two pieces. So after bishop d7, a3, this is one of these tricky moves. It's aimed against knight e7 because of b4. So bishop is in danger. Knight h6, h3. Limiting this knight to go to g4 and f5, castles, and rook f1. I would always enjoy and have great time playing this line with white. I don't care being down a pawn. I have great activity. I have great pieces. I like the, you know, like somehow all my pieces are just storming on the king's side. And not just that. Take a look at this terrible pawn on h5 with the king on g8. That definitely has to be considered a weak king on g8. Finally, I just want to show you one line that happens very often to me. So after queen f4, bishop c5, knight f3, I've just showed you what if they go straight forward for the queen b6 and trying to get a pawn back. What if they play just normal knight c6? You play knight c3. The point of knight c3 is that you do not allow them to play queen b6 because of the same idea. So if they go with bishop c2, bishop f2, king e2, knight a4, you win the bishop pair and play a3. With a3, I'm keeping the bishop pair, defending any knight b4. And I just want to play some b4, bishop a3, white just looks a lot better. In case of f6, for example, my practice and my experience and experience of my students showed that when they play f6, they just want to break in the center, and that's one of the most dangerous things in the practice. So we just bring the queen back to g3, threatening this pawn on g7. They can play queen c7 to defend it, and usually people forget about that because of knight b5. They gotta go king f8. If you go king f8, it looks ugly. Although there is a good thing about this position because they're about to break the center. You play knight h4 and you threaten knight g6. They gotta take by bishop, knight e5. On logical move, knight g7, you play bishop e3. That's a very difficult move. This is a very difficult line, and this is a top analysis. So when they take, you first include e takes f6. What a lovely variation. On your question, but Maya, why didn't you first take? Because if you take, and now play bishop e3, they would have bishop d6 with counterplay, with strong center, with problems for the queen on g3. And that's why we go with bishop e3 straight away with pawn on e5. Now we take, and when they play bishop d2 to, I don't know, misplace our king, we just go rook to d1, hide the king, and play certainly with safer king on c1 than the one on f8. Finally, if after knight c6, knight c3, f6, queen g3, king f8, and knight h4, they go knight e5, you go f4, kicking the knight away, you give check, and here when they go like this, they threaten to win the queen. You can't take on the rook, so you gotta play queen to d3. Rook is hanging, they gotta save it, check, and now you take the bishop. They take the knight, and you play f5. After he takes f5, bishop e2. With the bishop here, with a weak king on f7, we definitely have to give, from practical point of view, a huge advantage to white and to enjoy in this compensation and initiative here. Guys, I put all my efforts to teach you finally how to trade these Botvinnik Carl's system with the white pieces. My suggestion and vote goes take on c5 and try to keep that pawn as long as possible, or in like in return, try to at least come up with some sort of slowing down their game on the king side and simply avoiding these bishop c5 possibilities and make them as difficult as possible. Hope that you enjoyed the lecture and see you soon. Bye bye.